Welcome to the Nourish Child Podcast, a show about childhood nutrition, feeding kids, and dealing with the ups and downs of growing a healthy child. Here's your host, registered dietitian and childhood nutrition expert, Jill Castle.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Nourish Child Podcast. I'm Jill Castle, your host, and you can follow me on Instagram at IamPDRD or at the.nourished.child. I'm so excited today. I have Dr. Charlotte Markey on the show again. I'm so pleased to bring her back. She is a professor of psychology at Rutgers University, the director of the Health Sciences Center, and the author of 2 books, one of which we've talked about, the Body Image Book for Girls. And we talked about that back on episode number 122. And today we're going to talk about her latest book called Being You, the Body Image Book for Boys. Welcome, Dr. Markey. It's nice to have you back.
Thanks for having me again.
We have a little bit of a different format this time. The first time we were just audio podcasting, but now we actually get to look at each other and speak together on video, which is nice. So I'm so glad you wrote this second book. I think that, as we talked about before, it's very needed, but a recent statistic came out stating that 75% of boys are dissatisfied with their bodies. And I think that for my listeners out there who are mostly parents, but also for healthcare professionals who listen, might find that to be quite a staggering statistic. Can you tell us a little bit more about what is causing such a huge level of dissatisfaction in boys?
Yeah, I think it is surprising to most people because we've really feminized the discussion about these topics for so long and just assumed that boys are kind of A-okay as far as this goes. And it turns out that the history in terms of how we've been doing the research, how we've been asking the questions for decades now is really relevant, and that body image research basically didn't exist before the 1980s. And boys were not a part of that initial conversation really at all, because body image and eating disorder work was just going hand in hand. And then as we started to include boys in that work, probably in the 90s is when it really picked up. Some of the early work, asked boys the same sorts of questions we had been asking girls. Are you concerned about losing weight? What would happen if you lost 3 pounds is a common question in one of the most popular measures. And, boys will say, well, no to those questions. And so this is an oversimplification to some extent, but I think that led many researchers to believe, oh, well, boys seem to be doing okay. It's when you start asking them, are you concerned about your height? Do you wish you were more muscular? Are you concerned about your body build? Are you worried about getting enough protein? When you ask questions that are, it turns out, just much more relevant to boys, you start to see that a large percentage of boys, like the one study suggested up to 75% during adolescence, are concerned. They're worried. They don't feel good about themselves.
Yeah. And I know that probably a lot of things work into that, including just their normal developmental stage and the social emotional developmental milestones that happen, but then sort of place that in the center of social media. And particularly in the last 2 years when we've had this pandemic, and where have teenagers been able to connect with each other on social media? Can you elaborate a little bit about just the presence of social media and how it particularly affects boys?
Absolutely. I mean, the rates in terms of the amount of time that young people spend on social media and just on screens in general is pretty staggering. I think that the latest statistic I read is that adolescents are on screens 8 hours a day.
Wow.
So, it's really the influences that they're exposed to on social media or other forms of media are just, staggering. And for boys, that means being exposed to appearance ideals that are really unattainable. And so they're seeing, these really buff guys with six packs, and they never have their shirts on, and they're, pretty hairless except for really nicely, styled hair on their head typically. And so there's a number of things that are just not easily attainable, especially not by a young adolescent. And really not by any adolescent that should be spending time doing other things like going to school or, playing with their friends or hanging out with their family. To get these kinds of physiques is a full-time job that, celebrities and influencers have that time and those resources, but our adolescents don't.
Yeah. And so you brought up a couple of points that I wanted to touch back on. And it's this idea of their concerns are completely different from girls. Like they're worried about having hair, right? Is my sense, like maybe facial hair or body hair. And I know for myself, as somebody who's worked with young boys and middle school boys and adolescent boys, that I would almost chuckle inside when a middle school boy would say, can I, help me get bigger muscles? Tell me what to eat to get bigger muscles. And I'd think you need testosterone to get bigger muscles. It doesn't matter what food you eat,
Right.
So
absolutely.
What are some of the sensitive spots for boys? You said height,
muscles, hair, and I think those are the top three that I hear about over and over again. And I think we can't really overemphasize how concerning those particular issues are to boys, and how often boys will articulate if they're asked that, like, they don't want to take their shirts off at the pool. They don't want, they feel self-conscious. And it's the sort of self-consciousness I think we've almost accepted as normative among girls and just haven't appreciated also exists among boys.
Yeah. Yeah. And so what are some of the societal norms that have been imposed upon boys that have sort of put us in this place?
I mean, from the time boys are young, they're playing with action figures, right? So at least I like to insult Barbie dolls as being a culprit for girls' development of body image. But, when it comes to boys, there's a parallel. Action figures' chests have grown 150% since we were kids. So they look really different. And young kids who are playing with, Spider-Man or the Hulk or whatever latest Guardian of the Galaxy character that's out there, they look really different. And so they're getting exposed to this idea that masculinity is muscularity from a really young age. And then they start getting on social media and media before a lot of people realize. So, the average exposure to pornography online for boys is 11.
Wow.
And those men don't look like your average man either. They're, really toned, and, their attention to their bodies is much different than the average person's. And then social media is coming online right around that time as well. And so boys really are starting to think like, this is what I need to do to be sort of a man, to be considered attractive, to be appealing to a potential partner. And there was one study that it kind of cracks me up, except it's actually quite sad. But 6-year-olds were surveyed, and half of the 6-year-olds surveyed thought that they would look better if their muscles were bigger.
Wow.
And, they're 6, and it's half of them. I mean, 6-year-olds can't develop muscles, as you say. Like, this is partially hormonal and due to other factors. Like, it doesn't matter if you take any kind of hormone or steroids or whatever at 6, it's just pretty unlikely that anything would happen. So it starts young.
Wow. One of the parts in your book, which I thought, and your book is written for boys to read, and obviously parents too. I think it would be super helpful for parents to read it too. Just again, so everybody's using the same language and sort of has the same information. But you specifically wrote it for boys, which I appreciate so much. One part of the book, you really outline the different body shapes that boys could be. And I'm very used to seeing that for girls and for women, but that's the first time I've really seen the different body shapes that a boy could potentially be genetically inclined to have. Can you kind of tell our listeners, sort of describe some of those body shapes and how might a parent talk to their child about their body shape?
Yeah, I think it's really important that parents and healthcare providers appreciate that about 90% of our body size and shape is hereditary. Mm-hmm. And that's not incredibly different than height. So height is about 95%. And so we get so many messages in the media that suggest our bodies are just infinitely malleable. Like if we just go to the gym enough or just eat the right things, that we'll look completely different. But, there are short people, there are tall people, there are people who are rounder, there are people who are going to be just really lean, there are people who are not going to be really lean. And as I said, if you are a celebrity or an influencer, you can work against that genetic inheritance. Well, first of all, you probably have some good genetic inheritance working for you if you're in that position.
Yeah.
And then you can really work with it, let's say, by making it your job to look a certain way. But most of us don't have that working for us. And certainly boys have a hard time appreciating that when they're young, if that's all they're seeing, because they're seeing the imagery and they're getting the messages that if you just buy this product or you just get this protein powder or you just go to the gym or if you do these series of things that involve buying usually, right? There's a huge element of consumerism here. That then you can do this, you can achieve this. It's a matter of being disciplined enough. And it's just really unfortunate that that's where we're at, I think, socially and culturally, and that we don't have more conversations with kids that start with, wow, that person, that's really unrealistic. Most people don't look like that. I hope you don't hold yourself to that kind of standard. It's most important to me that you're healthy and taking good care of yourself. Mm-hmm. I want you to do really well in school. I want you to nurture your brain. I want you to have good relationships with other people. I want you to succeed essentially in all these other elements of life that have very little to do with having a six-pack.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's very powerful for a caregiver to be able to have the presence of mind to come out right away with something like that. And I think that there are parents who are very good at having those conversations. But I also think there are parents that are like so stunned when their child says something that indicates or hints towards body dissatisfaction, particularly from a boy, because that could be from out in left field, not expecting that one at all. So body satisfaction obviously ties into a lot of this body dissatisfaction. You talk about body neutrality. Let's dive into that a little bit in terms of what that is, so that parents understand what it is, and then how that can be tied to body confidence or body satisfaction for boys.
I love this concept of body neutrality. It's relatively new. Mm-hmm. It hasn't been empirically studied all that much yet, but it basically is this sort of in-between place, I think, where people feel relatively accepting of themselves and relatively unconcerned about their physicality.
Yeah.
And so it's really just sort of de-emphasizing the physical self. And for some, this is kind of a good endpoint, right? Like just sort of a sense of contentedness with who you are, how you look, and you're not going to worry about it. And for some, I think it's kind of a stepping stone towards a more positive body image, where for some people, it's like they're moving away from hating things about themselves to accepting them, to then maybe someday actually kind of liking them. But regardless, some elements, I think, of body neutrality, we should all, aspire to. So some sense of contentedness and acceptance, and also some just lessening of emphasis on our physicality, which is hard because we live in a culture that stresses how important it is all the time. And we all feel, I think, certain expectations from the people around us. And we see rewards associated with looking a certain way. But I think also we know as adults, and we want our kids to learn that being confident and being sort of self-possessed, even comfortable in your skin, can really increase how others perceive you in terms of attractiveness. Right? That not everyone who we think of as attractive fits into this, one single box. That there are people that can be sort of quirky or have their own style, or, their personality really enhances their attractiveness. And that's something I think we want to talk about more too. Like eventually, the really good-looking mean people don't have a ton of friends, right? So, is pay attention to other parts of who you are is the message. And we have to sometimes be explicit about this because, again, it's not a message kids get. They get sort of the opposite.
They do. And it's almost like parents need to sort of embrace running counterculture, really like actively practice counterculture language and conversations when it comes to body image. What's so interesting to me, because I've been writing lately about just cognitive and social emotional development. And one of the things about, understanding child development, which I find so fascinating as a dietitian who looks at how children eat and, feeding between parent and child, and like the concept of development is so important to all the different layers of how well a child sort of feels about themselves, right? Because if they're not attached from an early age, they're not very trusting and they're not nurtured to the next stage. And so it's, and I'm not a child psychologist, but you are. And so I feel like it's such an interesting tie-in that I feel gets lost for parents a little bit.
Right. I think that, we want our kids to feel like we are a secure place for them, that we love them unconditionally, that they don't have to look a certain way for us, that, we think that they're amazing for a variety of reasons. And we can do this, we can convey this by being complimentary about things that we weren't necessarily socialized to be complimentary about when we were growing up. And my kids sometimes tease me even because I'm so cognizant of this, and I have been ever since they were little, that if I say something like, "Oh, you look really nice today," then I'm always really careful to try to say like, "And you have such a good sense of humor," or "You're really smart," but they know exactly what I'm doing now because they've been subjected to this for so long.
Yeah.
But I think in general, the rule is sort of like, well, we don't have to always just compliment the outside, I think being explicit about things like, "I'm really proud of how you stood up for your friend today. I could tell that was hard, and your other friends were kind of teasing, and that takes a lot of courage. That makes me feel really proud of you. God, that was a really great joke. I can't believe you just came up with that spontaneously. You have a really cool sense of humor." There are so many wonderful things about adolescence in terms of their personalities that really emerge during this time of life.
Yeah.
They can just be so quick-witted. They can be sarcastic in ways that are incredibly funny. They can be really on to us as parents in ways that can also, I think, prompt humorous exchanges. And I think it's good to note that stuff, because we've all been socialized to focus on like, oh, wow, your hair looks great, or, you need a haircut, or, things that we see.
The grass is growing, the flowers are blooming, and spring is in the air. Spring is the perfect time for kids to discover, including new kinds of food and dishes. Designed to foster a love for the art and science of cooking, the Yummy Box from KiwiCo is the perfect ingredient for family bonding time. Whether you're inside or out, learning never tasted so good. I got to try the Tasty and Toasty project, which focused on how food browns when it cooks. We could actually see what happens when something browns while cooking, whether it's hamburgers on the grill or chicken nuggets in the oven. In fact, Yummy Crate was designed to foster a love for science and cooking in kids ages 6 to 14. Yummy Crate delivers high-quality cooking tools, recipes, and activities that explore hands-on experimentation and inspiration to build confidence and creativity in the kitchen, no matter the starting point. Step into spring and celebrate the season of discovery with Yummy Crate from KiwiCo. Get 30% off your first month plus free shipping with code NOURISHED at kiwico.com. That's 30% off your first month at kiwico.com, promo code NOURISHED. Or don't you look pretty today? That was one that's always like, self-care. So we talked a little bit about this in the Body Image Book for Girls interview. And I can't remember if we talked about that towards the tail end when you and I were offline, or if we actually reviewed it on the podcast, because I was so fascinated by it, because there's this fine line. It feels like you're raising a teenage boy, and all of a sudden they're putting gel in their hair. They're spending lots of time in the bathroom. They're walking around with their shirt off, body checking, looking in the mirror. And so it's like, is that inappropriate? Is that dangerous? Is that a red flag? Or is that perfectly normal for this age? And how do I know? And so you cover a concept in the book called adaptive appearance investment. Can you explain that and sort of help us all understand whether we should be panicking about our boys spending lots of time in the shower, in the bathroom, or if that's normal?
First of all, it's probably normal. This happens during adolescence. Kids are sort of failing out their new physical selves, and there's more attention to hairstyling and clothing and makeup for girls, and increasingly even some sorts of cosmetics for boys. Some of the undergraduates I teach have nail polish on, even the young men. So there's some of this is really normal, I think, and should just be viewed as fun. And so I would call that adaptive appearance investment. And appearance investment is just how much time and energy and even money are you putting into your appearance? Mm-hmm. And it's adaptive if it's a reasonable amount of time, it's, within your means financially, and it's psychologically not detrimental. Mm-hmm. And for, I think, a lot of adolescents, their appearance investment is somewhat adaptive because, like I said, they're just kind of exploring. When is it not adaptive? If they're doing something that has real risks. And usually we don't see a lot of that until adulthood, because kids don't have the means. Mm-hmm. Right. But I think when it's surgery, or, even something like tattoos, which I think a lot of people would say can be adaptive, but there's real risks if kids are young and they're not, if they're lying about their age so that they can do that or something. Right. I mean, I think that we don't want kids to make investments in their appearance that will permanently alter themselves in some way if they're not even fully developed yet. Like that's just really not a good idea, not healthy. For boys, we see it often in terms of supplement use.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of, they think they need a lot of protein. I don't understand where the protein myth came from because it really is a myth. You can only use, well, you know this better than I do, given your background, but you can only use so much protein and it's otherwise just excreted. And most people in well-developed countries get enough protein, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Or it turns into fat and weight gain.
Right. I mean, but boys especially really seem to get the message that like they should be taking protein powder. And there's a lot of social media attention to this particular trend as well. And, it's not regulated in the US. So you can walk into a Target and buy this stuff if you're 16. And they do.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think that kind of investment, it seems strange because boys may frame it as a fitness sort of investment, but a lot of it has to do with them wanting to be big and muscular.
Yeah.
And so it is an appearance investment. And I think when that's happening, we want to talk to our kids, like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
And really point them to some clear facts about supplements and really how unlikely they are to be advantageous.
Yeah. Yeah. So that sort of circles us back to this idea of comparison, self-comparison on social media. And tell us, what you know about that in terms of how it is influencing boys and sort of what's going on with that. I mean, obviously big muscles is the thing, right? It's just, I knew this 10 years ago. This was happening 10 years ago. It's just really accelerated, it seems, in the last couple of years. Is that what you're finding in your research? And yeah.
100%. And some of it definitely is social media. Some of it, as you mentioned, also is pandemic related, that when kids couldn't get out to interact with people, social media and other online forums became a lifeline. I mean, kids, you'll be shocked to hear, I'm sure, don't always want to interact with just their families that they were stuck with. And so, engaging with peers and people they find more relatable and more interesting, just really important to them. And, TikTok, I think, could be single-handedly responsible for some of this because TikTok is just so fascinating to young people. It captures their attention. It's really fast-paced. It's, of course, again, also pretty much completely unregulated. So there's a lot of misinformation that flourishes in those sorts of spaces. And yet it's compelling, right? Personal anecdote is so compelling to all of us, but especially to young people who don't have as much life experience. And so if someone on TikTok is telling you that you need protein powder and these, certain exercises, then of course that's, compelling.
Yeah.
If we all engaged with social media and we saw people and they looked great and they looked like they had these fantastic lives, and our reaction to that was, well, isn't that so great? They look great. They seem really happy. I'm really happy for them. Then social media or the media in general wouldn't really have negative consequences. But our sort of innate human response to seeing people who seem to be in some way better than us is to then feel bad about ourselves and to socially compare and to think, oh, well, I want that for myself. Why don't I have that many friends? Or why don't I have that six pack? Or, how do I get a girlfriend? Like all these, sorts of just normal developmental concerns are put on steroids, so to speak.
Yeah. And when you think of that middle school kid, developmentally, that's what they do. They self-compare. It's normal. That's what they're supposed to do. but they never, we never had the social media platforms where they were comparing themselves to just really unrealistic images. And you even get into that in the book too. You really do get into photo and video editing and really try to convey the idea that none of this is real. It's all photoshopped and perfectionized. And on the one hand, it is very intriguing because it is. But on the other hand, you have to kind of pull back the curtain and read between the lines and see that this is not reality. So I guess I'll, to wrap this up, I'll ask you the big question, which is, what should parents do? Like, what is your advice for parents? I know the book is for boys, but parents are probably just, oh my gosh, tell me what I should do if I am seeing my child, if my child is buying, protein powder at the grocery store or trying to lift weights in their room or on social media too long. What can parents do to help ward off some of this, some of these issues around body image for boys?
Well, I think that there are some sort of big picture things we can do as parents and then some more specific things. So to start with the big picture issues, I think we have to be really careful how we're modeling and talking about masculinity, and that definitely comes into play. So from the time a kid is really young, we're saying, oh, toughen up. Oh, walk it off. Oh, don't cry. Then when they get to be 14 and they want to lift weights and toughen up, well, this makes perfect sense. This is the messaging we've been giving them. And if instead we're just a little bit more careful and don't sort of perpetuate some of that language that has been really present for generations, but, basically talk to boys when they're upset, how we would traditionally talk to girls. Why are you upset? What's going on? How can I help? Not constantly suggesting that they should be stoic and strong. Yeah. I think that's really important. It plays into their development of body image and mental health more generally. And we also really want to be careful about how we talk about appearance culture and try to challenge and question it in our homes and try to say things about how unrealistic a lot of what our kids are seeing actually is. And so they grow up with some sense of like, that's not real. I shouldn't compare myself to that. Or, even really media literate adolescents, I think, start to get like, oh, that's silly. Right. Yeah. And that's great. More specifically, we want our kids to develop a healthy relationship with food. And you know this better than anyone, that this can be really tricky. Yeah. Feeding kids is hard.
Yeah.
It's incredibly humbling. It's incredibly challenging. But we can model having a healthy relationship with food. We can work on that for ourselves so that we can really try to foster that in our house. And that doesn't mean when we say a healthy relationship with food, that there's never any ice cream or never any soda or never anything that would be considered a treat, right? We have to allow for that as well. And we also really want our kids to develop a healthy relationship with physical activity so that they enjoy it and that they find out what they like. Right? Being active is something that's important for our whole lives, as long as we can do it, I suppose. Yeah. It's good for our mental and physical health. And it can be relatively cheap as far as a health intervention goes. And so if our kids are enjoying being on the soccer team, then we should try to encourage that. But if they're not, then we should help them find what they do like, even if that just means walking the dog regularly. Doesn't have to be a team sport, but just, let them know that this is good for them, that it's something that they can try to enjoy, try to find ways that it will become a part of their life for the long term.
Yeah. Yeah. In terms of that poor body image in boys extending to disordered eating and eating disorders, what are we seeing today? Like, what is the reality of that for listeners out there that might sort of be like, "Ooh, I think I'm in deep water here a little bit more than I thought"?
We know that 1/4 to 1/3 of eating disorder patients are male.
That's a lot.
And it's a lot. And it's a lot different than I would say even 10 years ago in terms of what we've been able to actually assess. And it's not to say that there's been such a dramatic change as much as I think our assessment is better now.
Mm-hmm.
But if your kid is really rigid about their eating behaviors, it doesn't necessarily have to mean that they're not eating. But if they are cutting out entire food groups, if they absolutely won't have anything that's processed or has sugar in it or carbs or, these are, I think, red flags, a certain degree of rigidity about this.
Yeah.
If they're really compulsive about exercise, if they're really invested in tracking what they're eating and how active they're being, and this is like a part-time job in their life, then especially for a kid, we really want to intervene. These are all potential red flags for boys. And it's trickier, I think, for boys because some of what is, in fact, disordered eating at the onset can look like a good health behavior.
Yeah.
And girls, I think it's sometimes a little more obvious because we have sort of a clearer sense of maybe what we're looking for. And if they're just completely restricting, then that's sort of obvious, right? Boys, it may be they're just like cutting out carbs. And at first we're like, oh, well, everyone does that for some period of time. It seems, we might not be too worried, but pay attention to really how serious it is in terms of the rigidity and is the person suffering, right? Is there a lot of mental preoccupation? Because once you have that mental preoccupation, it's distracting from other important areas of growth. Yeah. Right. If a kid can't concentrate as well in school, is avoiding socializing with friends, isn't engaging with the family or family meals or things like this, then there's a problem. And there's nothing wrong with calling in support. And oftentimes a pediatrician well visit is a good first stop. You want to make sure a kid's vitals are stable. Ask for blood work, call ahead of time. Tell them you're concerned so they know. Some of this you may or may not want the doctor to say in front of the child, depending on the child's age. But you may just want to get, a sort of a workup done in terms of blood work and blood pressure and things like that. And pediatricians sometimes miss this with boys if they're not alerted to it because they're not expecting it.
Right.
They've gotten a lot better, I think, in recent years, but we've seen the diagnoses of eating disorders double across the pandemic. Mental health has suffered these last couple of years. And I think we have to keep an eye on our kids.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Well, I am so thankful for both of your books, but particularly for being you, because you're really providing a resource for families to even just prevent. They have a resource to use to help prevent any of this with their boys. So tell us, or tell my listeners, where they can connect with you and find out more about your work and purchase your books.
You can go to thebodyimagebookforboys.com or thebodyimagebookforgirls.com. And from there, you can link to social media where I try to have some presence, and I have a lot of information and resources on the webpage, links to purchase books. So I think that's the best starting point, is just go to the book webpage, and you can send me a message if you need anything from there as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Charlotte Markey, on the show again. You're my first repeat guest, I believe. So,
an honor. Thank you.
I'm so glad that you could come on today. Thank you so much.
Of course, anytime.
Hi, friends. I just wanted to let you know that I've got a special summer season in store for you. I'm calling it the best of summer. Starting on June 9th, I will be airing a best of episode featuring several different topics where you can go deeper and learn. For instance, our first Best of episode will be called The Best of Becoming a Good Food Parent. I'm going to cover topics like extreme picky eating, brain development, why kids eat, weight challenges for children, and feeding young athletes. Whether you want to brush up on these topics or you're hearing them for the first time, these are designed to help you nourish and nurture your child inside and out. I'll be back on September 1st with a new season of fresh episodes featuring guest experts and interesting topics. Until then, make sure you're having an amazing summer, and I'll see you in September.
Thanks for listening to the Nourished Child Podcast, where the #1 goal is to help you grow a nourished child inside and out.